Rain hit the tin roof of the old farmhouse like 1,000 small hammers. Daniel sat by the window with a cup of cold tea in his hand, watching the storm grow worse over his fields. He had lived on this land for 6 years now, ever since he left his job with the Deep Space Cargo Company. Back then, he had traveled between planets, fixing engines and loading crates that came from worlds he could not even pronounce. Now his life was simple. He grew wheat, fixed old machines, and talked to almost no one. The storm outside was not a normal one. The sky flashed with colors that did not belong to a natural lightning storm, streaks of green and violet cutting through the black clouds. Daniel frowned and stood up, walking closer to the window. He had seen enough space traffic in his old job to know the difference between weather and something falling from orbit. A loud boom shook the house. The windows rattled and a cup fell from the shelf, breaking on the floor. Daniel grabbed his coat and old flashlight without thinking twice. Whatever had just crashed was close, maybe in the field behind his barn. He stepped out into the storm, boots sinking into wet mud. The wind pushed against him, but he kept walking toward the smoke rising in the distance. As he got closer, he saw it, a large metal shape half buried in the ground, still smoking, with cracks running along its surface like broken glass. It was a transport pod, the kind used to move cargo across star systems. He had loaded hundreds of these back in his old job. But this one was different. The side of the pod had a warning symbol he had never seen before, a symbol that usually meant the cargo inside was alive. Daniel walked around the wreck slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Steam hissed from a broken seal near the bottom of the pod. He pressed his ear against the metal and heard something, a small sound, almost like crying. His heart began to race. He searched for a way to open the pod and found a manual release lever near the back, half melted from the crash. He pulled hard, using all his strength, and after a few tries, the door groaned open with a burst of hot air. Inside, past the broken crates and torn cushioning, he saw movement. Small shapes huddled together in the corner, shaking. Daniel raised his flashlight slowly, not wanting to scare them. What he saw made him freeze completely. 3 small creatures sat pressed against each other, their scales catching the light in shades of deep blue, red, and green. They had wings, still too small to fly, folded tightly against their bodies. Their eyes, wide and glowing faintly, stared back at him with pure fear. Dragons, real, living dragons. Daniel had heard stories about them from traders in the old days, whispers of a species so rare that most people in the galaxy would never see one in their entire lives. He had always thought they were myths told to scare children or impress tourists at space bars. But here they were, real and trembling in front of him. One of them, the red one, let out a small whimper and tried to back away, but its leg was injured, twisted at an odd angle. The blue one pushed itself in front of the other two, baring tiny teeth at Daniel even though it was shaking with fear. The green one just stayed still, eyes half closed, breathing weakly. Daniel slowly lowered himself to the ground, trying to look smaller and less threatening. He remembered handling frightened animals before, back when he used to help injured livestock on nearby farms. Slow movements, soft voice, no sudden actions. "It's okay," he said quietly, though he doubted they understood human language. "I'm not going to hurt you." The blue one did not move away, but it also did not attack. It watched him closely, judging him the way any wild creature would judge a stranger. Daniel looked around the crash site. The storm was getting worse, and there was no way rescue teams would reach this remote part of the planet anytime soon, especially not for cargo that was not supposed to exist in local records. If he left them here, they would not survive the night, not with injuries like that. He thought about calling it in. He still had old contacts in cargo logistics who could report a crash like this. But something about the way these creatures looked at him, waiting for their fate to be decided by a stranger, made him hesitate. He had spent enough years around cargo handlers and shady transport routes to know that not everything shipped through those pods was there legally or safely. If he reported this, these 3 hatchlings might disappear into a system that saw them only as valuable cargo, not as living beings. Daniel made his decision quickly, almost without thinking. He removed his coat and wrapped it gently around the injured red hatchling first, lifting it carefully into his arms. The creature was warmer than he expected, its small body trembling against his chest. The blue one stepped closer, unwilling to be left behind, followed by the weak green one limping slightly. "Come on," Daniel said softly, "let's get you somewhere safe." He carried them back through the storm, his boots slipping in the mud, his arms shaking from the weight and the cold. The lights of his farmhouse were barely visible through the rain, but he kept walking toward them, one careful step at a time. Behind him, the wrecked transport pod sat silent in the mud, its warning symbol glowing faintly in the dark, a sign that somewhere out there, someone would soon come looking for what they had lost. But for now, 3 dragon hatchlings had found something they were never supposed to find in a place like this. They had found safety. The fireplace crackled softly, filling the old farmhouse with warm orange light. Daniel knelt on the wooden floor with a first aid kit open beside him, one that was meant for humans, not dragons. He had no idea if any of it would even work on scales instead of skin, but it was all he had. The red hatchling lay on a folded blanket, its injured leg stretched out carefully. It flinched every time Daniel touched the wound, letting out small huffs of smoke from its nostrils. Daniel spoke in a low, steady voice the whole time, not because he thought the words meant anything to the creature, but because the sound itself seemed to calm it down. "Easy now," he said, cleaning the wound with a damp cloth. "I know this hurts, just a little more." The blue hatchling sat close by, watching every movement with sharp, distrustful eyes. It had not left the red one's side since they arrived, standing guard like a small soldier despite being barely bigger than a cat. Every time Daniel reached toward the injured one, the blue dragon tensed, ready to react. The green hatchling was the quietest of the 3. It lay curled near the fire, eyes half closed, breathing slow and shallow. Daniel worried about that one the most. It had not made a single sound since the crash, not even a whimper. After finishing with the leg, Daniel wrapped a strip of cloth gently around it, tying it just tight enough to keep it stable. The red hatchling let out a small sound, somewhere between a whine and a sigh, and finally relaxed against the blanket. Daniel sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold night outside. He looked at the 3 creatures in front of him, still barely believing what was happening in his own living room. "You 3 are a long way from wherever you're supposed to be," he muttered. He remembered stories from his old cargo days, stories traders would tell quietly, almost like secrets. Dragons were not common cargo. They were rare, protected under strict galactic laws because their population had been hunted and captured for centuries by people who wanted their scales, their strength, or simply the prestige of owning something so powerful. If dragons were being shipped through a backwater route like this, it was not for a good reason. Daniel stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, searching for something the hatchlings might eat. He found some dried meat and a bit of leftover fish, setting them down carefully on a plate. The blue one sniffed at the offering first, cautious, before finally taking a small bite. It seemed to relax slightly after tasting the food, its tense shoulders lowering just a little. The red one, still weak from the injury, ate slower, but it ate. The green one did not move at first, but after a while it opened its eyes fully and looked toward Daniel, studying him carefully. "You don't have to be scared," Daniel said, sitting down a few feet away, giving them space. "I'm not going to hurt you, I just want you to get better." Hours passed as the storm outside slowly weakened into a gentle rain. Daniel stayed awake the entire night, watching over the 3 creatures, making sure their breathing stayed steady and their wounds did not get worse. At some point, exhaustion took over, and he found himself dozing off in the chair near the fireplace. He woke up to something warm pressed against his leg. Looking down, he saw the red hatchling had crawled closer during the night, curling up against him for warmth. The blue one was not far behind, lying just beside its sibling, finally allowing itself to rest. The green one was still near the fire, but its eyes were open, watching Daniel closely, almost as if trying to understand him. Daniel smiled softly, careful not to move too much and disturb the sleeping ones. "Guess I'm stuck with you three now," he whispered. As the morning light began to creep through the window, the reality of the situation slowly settled in. These creatures were not just lost animals he could return to nature once they healed. They were something far more valuable and far more dangerous to keep hidden, especially if someone came looking for their missing cargo. Daniel thought about his old contacts, people who still worked in logistics and cargo tracking. If a shipment like this went missing, someone would notice. Someone would come searching, and they might not care whether the dragons wanted to be found or not. He looked down at the three small creatures resting near him, trusting him despite barely knowing him, despite being terrified just hours ago. Whatever happened next, he knew he could not just hand them over to strangers claiming ownership over living beings, not without knowing exactly who was looking for them and why. Outside, the fields were quiet, the storm long gone, leaving only wet grass and a distant memory of chaos. But somewhere out in the galaxy, the loss of a rare and valuable shipment would not stay quiet for long. Daniel gently ran a hand over the sleeping red hatchling's scales, feeling the slow rhythm of its breathing beneath his palm. "I don't know what kind of trouble you three bring with you," he said softly, more to himself than to them, "but I promise you're safe here for now." Little did he know that promise would soon be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. 3 weeks had passed since the crash, and the farmhouse no longer felt as quiet as it once did. The red hatchling, now fully healed, had taken to following Daniel everywhere, from the barn to the fields, chirping happily whenever it managed to keep up with his long strides. The blue one had grown a little less suspicious, though it still watched every stranger who came near the property with narrowed eyes. The green one had finally started making sounds, soft rumbling noises that almost sounded like purring whenever it was content. Daniel had grown attached to them faster than he expected. He told himself at first that he would only keep them until they healed, until he figured out where they belonged. But watching them grow, watching them trust him more each day, made that plan feel impossible to follow through with. Late one evening, after finishing his usual chores, Daniel sat at his old desk with a cup of tea and an ancient data pad he had not used in years. He powered it on, waiting through the slow static as old contacts and cargo networks loaded onto the screen. If anyone would know something about a missing dragon shipment, it would be people from his old logistics circle, traders and dock workers who dealt with rare cargo routes. He typed a simple message to an old co-worker named Frank, someone he had worked cargo runs with for nearly a decade before retiring. Frank still worked in freight tracking, dealing with shipment records across several trade routes. "Heard anything about a cargo pod crash near the outer farming sectors, possibly transporting live animals?" Daniel typed, keeping the message vague on purpose. He did not have to wait long. Frank responded within the hour, his message short but filled with a nervous energy Daniel had not seen from him before. "Where did you hear about that? That shipment wasn't supposed to exist on record. If you know something, keep it quiet. The cargo belonged to people you don't want finding you." Daniel's stomach tightened as he read the message again. He typed back quickly, trying to sound calm. "What kind of people?" Frank's reply came slower this time, as if he was choosing his words carefully. "Traffickers, the real kind, not the small-time smugglers. They deal in rare species, mostly protected ones. Word is they lost a shipment recently, 3 young dragons, worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. If you saw anything, forget you saw it. These people don't forgive loose ends." Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, the glow lighting up his tired face in the dark room. Outside, he could hear the soft sound of the hatchlings sleeping near the fireplace, unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. Traffickers, the word settled heavily in his chest. These were not lost pets or misplaced cargo. These were creatures who had been captured, likely stolen from their real family, and shipped off to be sold to the highest bidder, treated as nothing more than valuable objects. He thought back to how frightened they had been that first night, how the blue one had tried to protect its siblings despite being terrified itself. That was not the behavior of simple animals being transporting for trade. That was the behavior of beings who understood fear, who understood loss. Daniel closed the data pad slowly, his mind racing. If traffickers were searching for their lost shipment, it meant they would eventually trace the crash site back to this area. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking, and when they did, they would not care about the hatchlings' well-being. They would only care about reclaiming valuable property. He stood up and walked over to where the three dragons slept peacefully by the fire. The red one stirred slightly, opening one eye to check on him before drifting back to sleep. The blue one, even in sleep, kept its body angled protectively toward its siblings. Daniel crouched down beside them, watching the gentle rise and fall of their small chests as they breathed. "I'm not letting anyone take you back to people like that," he whispered. He spent the rest of the night digging through old records, searching for anything related to dragon trafficking routes, protected species laws, and any galactic authorities who might actually care about a case like this. Most of what he found was discouraging. Corruption ran deep in certain trade sectors, and cases involving rare species often disappeared into bureaucratic silence, buried under bribes and missing paperwork. But he also found something useful. A small independent organization that tracked illegal wildlife trade across several star systems, one that had a reputation for actually following through on cases when given solid evidence. If he could gather proof, not just about the crash, but about the syndicate behind it, he might have a real chance at protecting the hatchlings permanently. It would not be easy. It would mean putting himself directly in the path of dangerous people who clearly did not care about breaking laws or hurting anyone who got in their way. Daniel looked over at the three sleeping dragons one more time before turning off the lights. Whatever was coming, he was not going to run from it. He had spent years working with cargo systems and understanding how shipments moved through hidden networks. If anyone had a chance at outsmarting traffickers on their own game, it was someone who used to be part of that world. He just hoped he still had enough time to prepare before trouble found its way to his front door. Outside, the night remained calm and quiet, the stars scattered peacefully across the sky. But somewhere out there, people were already searching, following faint traces left behind by a crash that was never meant to happen in a place like this. Dust rose along the dirt road leading to Daniel's farm as an unfamiliar vehicle approached, moving slower than most local trucks. Daniel noticed it from the barn window while repairing an old tractor engine, his hands still covered in grease. Something about the vehicle felt wrong, too clean, too polished for a farming road like this one. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the house, glancing back at the three dragons resting near the porch. The red one lifted its head immediately, sensing the shift in Daniel's posture. The blue one stood up fully, eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. "Stay here," Daniel said quietly, motioning for them to move behind the porch railing, out of clear sight. The vehicle stopped a short distance from the house, and two figures stepped out, dressed in official-looking uniforms with a symbol Daniel did not recognize stitched onto their sleeves. One of them, a tall man with a practiced smile, approached first while the other stayed near the vehicle, scanning the property with sharp eyes. "Good afternoon," the man said smoothly. "We're with the Galactic Wildlife Recovery Division. We are investigating reports of a cargo crash near this area involving protected species. Have you seen anything unusual recently?" Daniel kept his expression calm, years of dealing with difficult cargo clients giving him practice in hiding his thoughts. "Heard a storm a few weeks back. Big one. Didn't see any crash myself." The man's smile did not waver, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the porch, where the faint outline of small shapes could be seen moving behind the railing. "We have reason to believe the cargo, three young dragons, may have survived the crash and wandered into inhabited areas. It's important we recover them quickly. They require specialized care that only trained handlers can provide." Daniel crossed his arms, keeping his tone even. "If I see anything like that, I'll be sure to report it through proper channels. You have documentation for this recovery operation, official case number, maybe contact details for local authorities." The smile finally faltered slightly. These matters are often handled quietly, given the sensitivity of the species involved. Paperwork can slow down critical recovery efforts. Funny, Daniel said, his voice hardening just slightly. In my experience, legitimate operations always have paperwork, especially when dealing with protected species. The second man, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward, his expression less friendly. We don't have time for this. If you're hiding something, it would be smarter to hand it over now, before this becomes complicated. Daniel held his ground, though his heart was pounding. He had spent the last few weeks gathering everything he could find on trafficking networks, and these two fit the pattern Frank had warned him about: perfectly polished lies covering something far more dangerous underneath. I think you should leave, Daniel said firmly, and if you come back, I'll be contacting actual authorities about your recovery methods. The tall man's expression shifted completely, all pretense of friendliness disappearing. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Those creatures are worth more than everything on this farm combined. Handing them over now is your only smart option. Behind the porch railing, the blue dragon let out a low growl, small but sharp, clearly sensing the tension rising in the conversation. Daniel glanced back briefly, silently urging them to stay hidden. I said leave, Daniel repeated, stepping slightly forward, using his height and years of physical farm work to appear as intimidating as possible. This is my property. The two men exchanged a look before finally retreating to their vehicle, though the tall man paused before getting in. We'll be back, and next time we won't ask nicely. The vehicle sped off down the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust behind it. Daniel stood still for a long moment, watching until it disappeared completely from view. He turned back toward the porch, where the three hatchlings had emerged fully now, watching him with wide, worried eyes. The red one rushed forward, pressing against his leg, and the blue one stood close, still growling softly at the direction the vehicle had gone. It's okay, Daniel said, kneeling down to comfort them, though his mind was already racing through what needed to happen next. They won't be back tonight, but they will be back. He spent the rest of the afternoon making calls, first to Frank, then to a few other old contacts who might know people willing to help protect the farm if things escalated further. Word spread quickly through the small farming community once neighbors realized what kind of danger might be heading their way. Farmers who had known Daniel for years, people who valued loyalty and protecting the vulnerable above almost everything else, began arriving at his property that same evening, offering whatever help they could provide. By nightfall, Daniel's farm looked less like a quiet homestead and more like a gathering point for a small, determined group of neighbors, all willing to stand together against people who thought living creatures were nothing more than valuable cargo. Daniel looked around at the faces gathered in his yard, familiar faces he had known for years, now standing ready to help him protect three creatures none of them had even heard of a month ago. I don't know exactly what's coming, Daniel admitted honestly, but I know we're not letting them take these three without a fight. The three dragons sat near the porch, watching the gathering crowd with a mixture of confusion and quiet hope, sensing somehow that these strangers had come not to harm them, but to protect them. As night fell completely over the farm, everyone understood that whatever happened next would decide the fate of three small lives that had never asked to be caught in the middle of something so dangerous. The sound of engines cut through the quiet night, growing louder as several vehicles approached the farm from different directions. Daniel stood near the barn, watching the headlights spread out across the dark fields, surrounding the property from multiple angles. This was no longer a simple visit from two men pretending to be officials. This was a full operation. Around him, nearly a dozen neighbors stood ready, armed with whatever tools they had available, farming equipment repurposed for defense, old hunting rifles kept for dealing with wild animals, and simple determination that came from years of standing together as a community. Positions, Daniel called out, his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. Keep the hatchlings behind the house. No one touches them. The three dragons had been moved into a reinforced section of the barn, a space Daniel had spent the last few hours preparing, lined with old metal sheets he had used years ago for equipment storage. It would not stop everything, but it would slow down anyone trying to reach them directly. The vehicles stopped just beyond the property line, and figures began stepping out, far more than the two men from before. At least 8 armed individuals moved forward, weapons raised, clearly prepared for a violent confrontation rather than another conversation. "Last warning," the tall man from before called out, standing at the front of the group. "Hand over the cargo and no one gets hurt." Daniel stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between the approaching group and the barn. "They're not cargo, they're living beings, and they're staying right where they are." The tall man's expression hardened. "Have it your way." The confrontation exploded into chaos almost instantly. The syndicate's men moved forward aggressively, and Daniel's neighbors responded with everything they had prepared. Farm equipment that had been rigged earlier that day sprang into action, wires connected to old machinery creating unexpected obstacles, nets that had been set up along entry points tangling around the legs of anyone who charged too quickly. Daniel had spent years working with cargo systems and machinery, and that knowledge proved surprisingly effective in creating improvised defenses. An old irrigation system, modified earlier that evening, sprayed high-pressure water directly at a group of approaching mercenaries, disorienting them just long enough for neighbors to push them back. Inside the barn, the three hatchlings listened to the chaos outside, their small bodies trembling with fear and something else, a rising instinct they did not fully understand yet. The red one paced anxiously near the barn door, while the blue one pressed against the metal walls, growling low and steady. Outside, the fight grew more intense. One of the syndicate's men managed to break through the initial defenses, moving quickly toward the barn with clear intent. Daniel spotted him immediately and moved to intercept, but the distance was too great to close in time. Just as the man reached the barn entrance, a sudden burst of heat erupted from inside, not large, but enough to startle him backward, stumbling away from the door in shock. The red hatchling stood just inside the entrance, small wisps of smoke rising from its nostrils, its body shaking from the effort of producing even that small burst of fire. The man recovered quickly, raising his weapon toward the hatchling, but before he could act, Daniel tackled him from the side, knocking the weapon away and pinning him to the ground with the strength built from years of physical farm labor. "Stay away from them," Daniel growled, holding the man down until two neighbors arrived to restrain him fully. The fight raged on for several more tense minutes, the syndicate's forces slowly being overwhelmed by the combination of clever defenses and the sheer determination of people fighting to protect something they believed in. Just as the tide seemed to be turning fully in their favor, a new set of lights appeared in the sky, descending rapidly toward the farm. A galactic peacekeeping vessel landed just beyond the property line, its markings clearly official, nothing like the fake credentials the syndicate had tried to use earlier. Armed officers spilled out quickly, moving with practiced precision to secure the area and detain the remaining syndicate members. Daniel later learned that Frank, worried after their earlier conversation, had quietly alerted contacts within the peacekeeping division about a possible trafficking operation targeting a remote farming settlement. The evidence Daniel had gathered over the past few weeks, along with witness accounts from the confrontation itself, gave the peacekeepers more than enough to make immediate arrests. As the chaos finally settled, Daniel made his way back to the barn, his body aching from the fight, but his mind focused entirely on the three hatchlings inside. He pushed open the door carefully, and immediately the red one rushed forward, pressing against him despite the exhaustion clearly visible in its small body. The blue and green ones followed closely, all three finally allowing themselves to relax now that the danger had passed. Peacekeeping officers moved through the property, gathering evidence and speaking with Daniel and his neighbors about everything that had happened. One officer, clearly in charge of the operation, approached Daniel directly, glancing toward the three hatchlings still pressed closely against him. "You do realize what you just did?" the officer asked, a mixture of disbelief and respect in her voice. "You took on an entire trafficking operation to protect three dragons you found by accident." Daniel looked down at the three creatures, now resting calmly against him, no longer trembling, no longer afraid. They didn't ask to be caught up in any of this, seemed like the right thing to do. The officer studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Well, whatever happens next with the legal side of things, I think it's safe to say these three owe their lives to you." As the peacekeeping vessel prepared to take the captured syndicate members away, Daniel finally allowed himself a moment to breathe, looking around at his exhausted but victorious neighbors, and down at the three small dragons who had somehow become the most important part of his quiet, simple life. The battle was over, but Daniel knew the real challenge. Deciding what would happen to the three hatchlings now was only just beginning. Sunlight spread gently across the farm the next morning, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Daniel sat on the porch steps, sipping tea while watching officials move carefully around his property, documenting everything related to the failed trafficking operation. The three hatchlings stayed close to him, no longer hiding their presence from strangers, seemingly aware that the immediate danger had finally passed. A different vehicle arrived later that morning, one clearly marked with official galactic symbols rather than the fake credentials used by the syndicate. A woman stepped out, dressed in a formal uniform, carrying a data pad filled with documents. She introduced herself as a representative from the Galactic Species Protection Authority, an organization responsible for handling cases involving rare and protected creatures. "Mr. Daniel," she said politely, extending a hand, "I've been briefed on everything that happened here. First, thank you for what you did. Trafficking cases like this rarely end with the creatures actually being saved." Daniel shook her hand, still feeling the exhaustion from the night before. "I just did what felt right. They needed help." The woman nodded, glancing toward the three hatchlings watching her carefully from a short distance away. Typically, in cases like this, protected species are relocated to specialized sanctuaries designed to care for their specific needs. It's standard procedure to prevent further exploitation. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly at those words, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. He had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it out loud still felt heavier than he expected. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just want to make sure they're actually safe wherever they end up." The woman studied him for a moment before glancing back at the hatchlings. "Would you mind if I observed them for a bit? Sometimes recently rescued creatures react differently depending on their environment." Daniel nodded, stepping back slightly to give her space. The woman approached the three dragons slowly, speaking softly and offering a small device that likely measured stress levels or basic health readings. The red hatchling sniffed at the device cautiously before backing away, moving quickly to press against Daniel's leg instead. The blue one reacted more defensively, positioning itself protectively in front of its siblings, growling softly at the unfamiliar woman despite her calm approach. The green one, usually the quietest, let out a small huff of smoke, clearly displeased with the stranger's presence. The woman stepped back, observing their behavior carefully before making a few notes on her data pad. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. "What is it?" Daniel asked, curiosity mixing with concern. "Dragons, even young ones, are known for being highly independent and difficult to bond with quickly," she explained. "In most rescue cases, hatchlings show initial distrust toward everyone, including their rescuers, especially after traumatic experiences like trafficking and crashes." She looked toward Daniel, then back at the three hatchlings still clustered protectively around him. "But these three are showing clear signs of imprinting, strong loyalty, protective behavior toward you specifically, and visible distress when separated. This level of bonding usually takes months, sometimes years, to develop naturally." Daniel glanced down at the three creatures, feeling a strange mixture of pride and worry. "Is that a bad thing?" The woman shook her head slowly. "Not necessarily. but it does complicate standard relocation procedures. Removing them now, separating them from someone they've bonded with this strongly, could cause significant emotional distress, possibly even physical health issues in extreme cases. She spent the next few hours conducting further observations, speaking with Daniel about everything from the crash to how he had cared for the hatchlings during their recovery. She also reviewed the evidence Daniel had gathered regarding the trafficking syndicate, along with statements from the peacekeeping officers who had responded during the confrontation. By late afternoon, she returned to Daniel with a decision that surprised him. Given the unique circumstances of this case, the strength of their bond with you, and your clear ability to provide proper care despite lacking formal training, the authority is willing to consider an alternative arrangement, she explained. Instead of standard sanctuary relocation, we can grant you legal guardianship status, provided you agree to regular check-ins and follow basic guidelines for their continued care and development. Daniel blinked, processing the offer carefully. You're saying I get to keep them, officially? Essentially, yes, the woman confirmed. It's not a common arrangement, but nothing about this situation has been common, given how well they've already adapted under your care and the clear risk of emotional harm from separation. This seems like the best option for their well-being. Daniel looked down at the three hatchlings, who seemed to sense the significance of the conversation, all three pressing closer against him as if afraid he might disappear if they let go. I accept, he said without hesitation. Over the following weeks, life on the farm slowly returned to a new kind of normal, one that now included 3 growing dragons instead of just quiet solitude. The red one grew braver each day, often trying to help with simple farm chores despite being far too small to actually assist. The blue one remained protective, always staying alert whenever unfamiliar visitors came near the property. The green one grew increasingly playful, finally shedding its earlier quiet nature entirely. Word of what happened spread slowly through nearby communities, turning Daniel's quiet farm into something of a curious local legend, the place where an ordinary human had taken in 3 dragons and successfully protected them from dangerous traffickers. Sitting on his porch one evening, watching the 3 hatchlings chase each other playfully across the field, Daniel found himself smiling at how drastically his simple, quiet life had changed. He had never expected dragons to become part of his family, and the galaxy certainly never expected a farmer's home to become their sanctuary. But sometimes, the last place anyone expected to find something extraordinary turned out to be exactly where it belonged.